The concrete dust still hung in the winter air when the word finally came down. On a gray January morning in 1984, workers at the Marble Hill Nuclear Generating Station outside Hanover, Indiana, stood on half-finished platforms and scaffolding, waiting for instructions. They'd poured concrete into forms that reached several stories high, threaded rebar through labyrinths of steel, and watched the twin cooling towers climb into the sky above the Ohio River. For years, the message had always been the same: keep going. Deadlines slipped, costs climbed, questions piled up, but the work never stopped. That morning, it did. Supervisors walked through the site with tight faces, calling crews together. Men shut down welders, killed generators, and stepped away from the forms. On the unfinished containment dome of Unit 1, a foreman told his crew to leave their tools where they were. The project was being suspended. No one wanted to say the word abandoned yet, but the truth settled over the site as the workers climbed down. Billions of dollars in concrete, steel, and equipment stood half-built on a ridge in rural Indiana. The plant that was supposed to power the state's future would never produce a single watt. The story of how Marble Hill reached that moment began a decade earlier, in the early 1970s, when nuclear power looked like the answer to America's growing appetite for electricity. Public Service Indiana, the state's largest investor-owned utility, was under pressure to meet projected demand from factories, growing suburbs, and new appliances in nearly every home. Coal was dirty and increasingly controversial. Nuclear was marketed as modern and almost limitless. In 1973, PSI announced plans for a 2-reactor nuclear station along the Ohio River in Jefferson County. Each unit would be a pressurized water reactor designed by Westinghouse, capable of producing more than 1,000 megawatts. Promotional material promised jobs, tax revenue, and cheap electricity for decades. Local officials imagined new schools, paved roads, and businesses attracted by stable power. For nearby Hanover and Madison, the plant looked like a once-in-a-generation economic windfall. The price tag at the beginning was steep, but manageable. Early estimates put the cost of Marble Hill at around $1.4 billion. That was a serious investment for a utility the size of PSY, but not unimaginable in an era when regulators usually approved rate increases to cover construction. The company secured financing and, in 1977, broke ground. Earth movers carved terraces into the hills. Cement trucks rolled in day and night. At peak, more than 4,000 workers crowded the site. From a distance, the rising concrete shells looked like proof that the future had arrived. Inside the forms, however, problems were already setting in. Nuclear plants are built to standards far stricter than ordinary power stations. Every pour of concrete, every weld, every piece of rebar has to meet specifications laid out in design documents and monitored by quality assurance inspectors. Those inspectors began raising red flags early at Marble Hill. Concrete was being poured without proper vibration, leaving hidden voids and honeycombing. Reinforcing steel was sometimes misplaced or inadequately tied. In some cases, workers patched visible defects instead of removing and replacing bad material. At first, PSI treated these issues as the normal friction of a huge construction job. Repairs were made, reports filed, and the work continued. But by the late 1970s, the picture had darkened. The 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania in 1979 shook public confidence in nuclear power and tightened scrutiny from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. At the same time, interest rates soared, making borrowed money far more expensive. Each month of delay at Marble Hill added millions in financing costs. Quality control problems kept coming. Whistleblowers inside the project accused contractors of cutting corners to keep on schedule. Some inspectors claimed their reports were ignored or rewritten. Investigators later documented cases where substandard concrete pours were signed off without proper testing. In a nuclear plant, the strength of those structures is not a cosmetic issue. They form the last barrier between a critical reactor core and the outside world. Opponents of the project, local activists, consumer advocates, and environmental groups, seized on these findings. They argued that PSI was throwing good money after bad, gambling with both safety and the wallets of ratepayers. Public hearings turned tense as citizens questioned why bills were already rising to pay for a plant that existed mostly on paper and in partial construction. Some accused the company of using regulatory rules that allowed construction work in progress to shift costs onto customers long before the plant would ever turn on. By 1980, the numbers were staggering. The estimated cost of Marble Hill had ballooned from the original $1.4 billion to more than $7 billion. The nation was in a recession. Electricity demand was not growing as predicted. Suddenly, the justification for such a massive nuclear build looked shaky. But PSI had already sunk hundreds of millions into the site. To executives and many politicians, stopping seemed unthinkable. They pressed on, arguing that backing away now would waste everything already invested. Pressure mounted from another direction as well. The NRC grew increasingly concerned about the construction deficiencies. Inspectors wanted proof that the plant's concrete and steel met design requirements. Fixing suspect work would require expensive demolition and repouring. At the same time, investors worried about the utility's debt load and the risk that regulators might not let it recover all of its costs through rates. The project was caught between engineering doubts and financial limits. In 1983, the situation reached a breaking point. An independent review concluded that Marble Hill would require billions more to finish, and that PSI's finances were at risk of collapse if it tried. Indiana regulators signaled they were no longer willing to simply approve rate hikes tied to the plant. Consumer groups pushed for investigations into how costs had gotten so far out of control. Legislators began asking pointed questions about the role of mismanagement and poor oversight. Inside the company, executives studied stark spreadsheets. Completing Marble Hill might require doubling or even tripling electric rates over time. Canceling it meant writing off what had already been spent and facing lawsuits from bondholders and contractors. The utility's credit rating was sliding. For a regional power company, catastrophe was no longer hypothetical. It was visible on the balance sheets. In January 1984, PSI made the call. The Marble Hill project would be halted. Work stopped immediately. The twin reactor containment structures remained open at the top, ringed by rusting rebar. The cooling towers stood like giant, unfinished monuments above the river. Specialized equipment, some of it never removed from crates, sat in warehouses and on the exposed ground. Over the following years, much of it was sold for scrap at a fraction of its purchase price. The damage didn't end at the construction fence. Ratepayers had already been paying for Marble Hill through higher electric bills. Even without completing the plant, the company needed to recover enough money to stay solvent. That sparked battles in the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission and the courts over how much of the failed project's cost could be passed on to customers. Consumer advocates argued that ordinary people were being forced to cover the consequences of corporate misjudgment and lax oversight. PSI countered that without some recovery, the utility itself might fail, threatening service across the state. The surrounding communities felt the loss in another way. When the project was announced, Jefferson County leaders expected long-term tax revenue and steady employment. Instead, they watched thousands of jobs vanish almost overnight. Local businesses that had sprung up to serve construction crews, motels, diners, equipment suppliers, struggled or closed. The unfinished plant became a landmark for all the wrong reasons. a reminder of promises that had turned hollow. In the years afterward, Marble Hill's ruins drew journalists, policy analysts, and critics of the nuclear industry. They pointed to it as an example of how complex engineering projects can spiral when optimism, political pressure, and financial incentives drown out warning signs. The concrete shells, weather-stained and empty, offered a physical record of decisions made in conference rooms and hearings far from the ridge above the Ohio River. Eventually, much of the site was dismantled. Equipment was stripped. Certain structures were demolished or sold. But for a long time, anyone driving the back roads near Hanover could glimpse the hulking remains of the cooling towers rising over the trees, a snapshot of a plan that never reached its final step. The Marble Hill nuclear construction failure did not end with an explosion or a visible disaster. There was no meltdown, no evacuation, no emergency broadcast. The damage was measured instead in billions of wasted dollars, in trust lost between a utility and the people it served, and in a community left with the skeleton of a project that was supposed to secure its future. The plant existed long enough to reshape lives and rates and politics, but never long enough to turn its turbines. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.